Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Don't forget to go and spoil yourself and get yourself a lovely cup of drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. This is a full story. Sometimes I do them in two parts, because there's a great deal of work involved in putting a story together, and so sometimes the stories, when they're long, it's impossible to do it in one part, I'm afraid. So I know some people don't like that, but I'm very sorry about it. It's just so much work. But the main thing is that you get to listen to quality stories, and that's what this is all about. And I'm so glad you've joined me this evening. So let's get started with our story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, they often say things happen in threes. Could that be the case when it comes to the subject of death? Edith Swanson seemed to think so. She had strong feelings in regards to the matter. But who did she think she was? She wasn't God. Yet despite this, she wasn't afraid to tell everyone in our entire neighbourhood that one was down, there was still two more to go, as if we were all green glasses on the wall, and two more of these glasses would accidentally fall in quick succession, one after the other. There were two more people to die in our neighbourhood, she exclaimed, as if stating an absolute fact, and her words were not received with rapturous applause, but with disgusted revulsion. How could she have the blatant audacity to say this? People took everything Edith Swanson said with a pinch of salt. She claimed to be a bit of a psychic, and fancied herself as some kind of a white witch, which most people thought was hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense, as if Edith occupied a fanciful, fictitious world of her own making. If you visited her house, there was always some herbal concoction smouldering away on her hob, with a white vaporous kind of mist rising out of a large black cauldron, giving off some pungent woody and herby notes. Let's just say she had a whole range of interesting tinctures on display in her kitchen cabinet, all neatly labelled, that she claimed had miraculous healing powers. In our neighbourhood, people brushed off Edith's fanciful claims like the cat's hairs on a coat, and most would throw out any potions she gave them, without even batting an eyelid. One day when Edith heard I had a bad migraine headache from a brief conversation with my husband, whom had been putting out the bins for the garbage delivery that morning, Pearson had inadvertently bumped into Edith on the street. They had engaged in light-hearted neighbourly conversation, as you do. It was difficult to escape Edith. She was quite the talker. On learning about my headache from my husband, she had unhesitantly popped over to my house, armed with one of her tinctures to save the day, to lift me away from the clamorous heavy metal orchestra pounding away violently in my head with no remission. My head had been throbbing above my temples, and I'd been sleeping in a dark room devoid of any light. The obtrusive, unwelcome knock at the front door made me want to scream. I wanted to be left alone, to wallow in my misery, and fight back the billowing waves of nausea that washed the back of my throat. When I had a migraine headache, it tended to cling to me like a limpet on a rock, refusing to abate, and would hang around for 3 days with a tenacious grip. I reluctantly ambled over to the front door. I would have liked to have ignored the knocks, but whoever was outside was very persistent, as if they knew I was at home. I couldn't exactly pretend I wasn't there. I audibly groaned as I saw Edith standing there in the doorway, holding up a tincture for me, with the obscure outlandish name Jo Jampson on it. In truth, she was the last person I wanted to see with her light, easy-going, happy nature, that could be incredibly annoying when you feel like a dark thundercloud. She smiled at me brightly, her black lipstick making her teeth look startlingly white. "Your husband told me you're having a hard time. This will cut your headache in an instant," she told me. Edith was a woman in her early 30s. She dyed her hair a bright turquoise blue colour that seemed to show off her green eyes, and she always wore bohemian loose-flowing clothes in layers, and long dangling eclectic earrings that resembled miniature dream catchers, and hundreds of bright bangles on her arms. "I know you threw all the other tinctures I made you away in the past, but I urge you to give this a go. You won't be disappointed, I promise you. Your headache will be gone within minutes. I've perfected the ingredients over the years. I used to suffer from migraines myself, but now they are a thing of the past." I could hardly believe what she was saying. I was very cynical and rather dismissive about what she was saying, but I reluctantly took the tincture from her, mumbling a cursory thank you, slamming the door rudely in her face, leaving her standing in the doorway looking rather bemused, but thankfully she walked away. I didn't mean to be rude, but my headache had overtaken my social graces and suppressed any desire for me to be civil to anyone, least of all the annoying Edith Swanson. Even my husband described me as like a bear with a sore head whenever I was experiencing one of my migraine attacks. If you've ever been unfortunate enough to be acquainted with a pounding migraine headache, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I had tried anything and everything, from all manner of pills recommended by the pharmacist, but nothing had remotely dulled the pain. I examined the strange tincture in my hand, a tiny bottle with a rubber cap and dropper. What did I have to lose? I decided I would take the tincture. I doubted it would work, but when you're desperate, as I was, you'll eat baked beans with maple syrup and mustard if it'll bring an end to the relentless pain and the insufferable nausea that has held you captive to its mercy. I opened the tincture, and the smell of the liquid was enough to make me gag. The foul-tasting liquid slipped down the back of my throat. But I kid you not, within 5 minutes my migraine headache had completely gone. I've never had a migraine slip away that fast. I knew that this unlikely tincture, given to me by a woman proclaiming to be a white witch, had worked like magic, and in a moment a new respect for the quirky street character Edith Swanson was born. Maybe she wasn't such a fruitcake after all. Perhaps she did know what she was talking about, and I had underestimated her. So when the news got around our neighbourhood that old Mr. Julian Kindle had died of pancreatic cancer, it travelled faster than greased lightning, over yard fences, through doorways and at local watering holes. But when Edith Swanson said there were 2 more people in our neighbourhood to go, that was not taken very well by many residents, who once again thought Edith Swanson was completely kooky. I, on the other hand, pondered over her words with great reflection. "Edith, listen to yourself. Everyone knew Mr. Kindle was going to die sooner or later," one of the neighbours pointed out. "We've been seeing nurses coming and going out of his property for a long time now. You're talking nonsense. No one around here is going to die. You do only half spout hocus-pocus half the time." Edith Swanson was used to being mocked, belittled and ridiculed, with her strange idiosyncratic ways and bohemian beliefs. But when she said there were 2 more to go, for some irrational, unexplainable reason, I actually believed her. Of course I didn't want to, but I had learnt that Edith Swanson was proving to be right about many things. It would seem a week later, with a timely efficiency, a young man living in our neighbourhood was struck down by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot into the lungs. He died at 20 years old. The news went down with the locals in our neighbourhood like a lead balloon, and there were whispers among many that maybe Edith Swanson was right after all, and there was 1 green bottle still left hanging on the wall. Little did I know that that very last bottle would come crashing down, far too close for comfort, and it would literally hurl a wrecking ball at my own life, bringing the life I'd known for the last 10 years to a very swift grinding halt. If 1 final green bottle was to come crashing down in our neighbourhood, I never believed for a moment it would personally affect my own life. But then again, we always believe that it'll happen to somebody else, don't we? That's how we're inclined to think. It's called self-preservation. It was on one inauspicious evening, a week after 22-year-old Eddie Gonzalez had lost his life so tragically to a pulmonary embolism, that I was at home, sitting on the sofa, cradling my 2-week-old baby in my arms, as, believe it or not, during the last couple of weeks when there had been chaotic pandemonium in our neighbourhood, after the inauspicious death of 2 residents. During that turbulent 2 weeks, I had given birth to a 7-pound, 4-ounce baby boy called Zachary. He was fast asleep in my arms right now. I didn't want to wake him up. It had been the most harrowing delivery, bringing baby Zachary into the world, for he came out with much protesting, kicking and screaming, clearly not wanting to be born. Despite the epidural, his birth had been one of extreme discomfort that had required an episiotomy that had put me off the idea of ever having another baby again, as all the blood and stitches were still causing insufferable nagging pains that I was unlikely to ever forget. I was sitting on the white cotton couch of our living room area when my husband phoned me. He had already picked up our 5-year-old daughter Kendall from her friend's house, where they'd spent the afternoon together playing dollies, and judging by her happy garrulous chatter that I could hear in the background, I could tell she had clearly had a great time. "I've just picked up Kendall," my husband told me, "from Macy's house. It seems she had a fabulous time playing dollies with her friend." He pauses for a brief moment. "How you doing?" he asked, his voice sounding solicitous, as he knew I'd experienced a rough 2 weeks, as I was still recovering from the birth of little Zachary, and my body was still healing from the trauma of childbirth, which, believe you me, can knock your body out as if you've been a matador fighting a hefty bull in a circuit. Childbirth is certainly not for the faint-hearted. "As well as can be expected. I'm still exhausted." "You poor sweetheart," he said obsequiously. "How about I pick up a takeout for us? What do you fancy? Indian, Chinese, Italian, or Mexican?" "You know what? I fancy an Italian pizza. That would be so good," I said, knowing that the Italian restaurant I liked was a little bit out of the way. But they made the best pizzas in the whole world, and all that melted cheese, tomato sauce and garlic was already making my stomach rumble, as I had not eaten a thing all day. "Pizza it is, then. What kind would you like?" "Just the plain margherita. Nothing fancy." "Margherita it is, then. I'll be home very shortly. You just relax." Little did I know that the final green bottle was about to fall off the wall, and those would be the very last words I would ever exchange with my husband, and I would never feel quite the same way about pizza again, merely by association. I was sitting there on the couch, cradling little Zachary in my arms. I was far too afraid to flinch or jerk my body awkwardly, lest I should wake him from his slumber. I knew our new evening routine very well. When my husband Pearson returned home, we'd eat dinner together. Pearson would bath Kendall, put her to bed, read her a bedtime story, while I nursed Zachary, changed his diaper, put him to sleep in his bassinet, after which I would take a much-needed kip myself. Pearson would remain up to attend to Zachary, while I slept. At about midnight, my diligent husband Pearson would retire to bed, and I would awaken to my baby's cries, dutifully spending the ungodly hours of the rest of the evening attending to Zachary, who became overactive late at night. It had deprived me of so much sleep over the last couple of weeks, as babies don't discriminate between night and day. On this indelible occasion, I sit back on the couch, not daring to disturb my infant, lest he should cry. I can't bear it when he cries. I stare blankly at the filmy black of a TV set, with a remote control buried under the velvety cushions of the creamy striped upholstered chair opposite me. If I get up to retrieve the control, I might just awaken my sleeping infant. I realise that even though I would like to expend some long-suffering, lonely minutes watching some lively entertainment on the box, the last thing I want is to appease a screaming baby. Zachary may only be 2 weeks old, but he has a pair of lungs on him that could wake the living dead. It seems ironic that I'm sitting there quietly, with the long velvety curtains pulled wide open, their length bruising against the parquet floors. The tenebrific night stares in at me, swathing the large living room area of our craftsman-style home in its looming dark shadows. I would love nothing better than to switch on the lamp on the side table, but my arms aren't long enough to reach the plug. If I move too much, I will awaken Zachary. My stomach growls in eager anticipation, as I find myself fantasizing about the cheesy pizza that was on its way to me. I'm hungry. I have found that breastfeeding and sleepless nights have made me hungrier than ever. The warm body of our labradoodle Lassie lies at my feet in a curled-up ball. It is Lassie who hears the car approaching our house before I do. Her head perks up from her sleeping position. Her ears stand up erect, while a low guttural bark emanates from the back of her throat. She instinctively rises to her feet and tears down the passage like a charging bullet to the front door and begins to bark. Moments later, I see the bright lights of a car moving towards our house. as rubber tires roll over the gravel driveway. I listen expectantly, for the familiar sound of the garage door opening and closing, for the sound of the kitchen door that leads directly from the garage to open abruptly. In a second I expect my little daughter to come bustling through the kitchen, skipping cheerfully over the parquet floors with her dolly in her hands, running up to me happily, saying, "Mummy, we're back now. We had so much fun. I was playing with Macy. We played with our dolls all day." I regret to say that does not happen, as I'd hoped it would. Instead, my worst fears will soon be realised. I hear strange, unfamiliar, but authoritative footsteps walking towards the front door, and the wrought iron knocker is rapped very formally. Soon the knock is followed by the sound of our front door singing jingle bells, which I know is very inappropriate for this time of year, but the bell was given to me as a Christmas present, and I've never been able to change the tune. Reluctantly I rise from the sofa, manoeuvre my aching body that feels as feeble and fragile as an 80-year-old woman, down the passage towards the front door, which I open cautiously. In the beginning I peek through a crack, but open it slightly wider when I realise I'm looking at an authority figure. An official-looking officer stands before me, wearing woven black pants and a woven shirt covered in badges, and he has a belt with a Holty and revolver on the side. I notice his black car with its flashing lights in the driveway reads Black Panther's Security Patrol, but I cannot make sense of what he's saying. He's speaking in a low monotone voice. His words are evasive, ethereal, like fireflies you try to gather in your hands, but they elude you by flying away. "Are you Amanda Smithson?" he asks me. I nod. "What is this about, officer?" I ask, hugging the door tightly with one hand, while snuggling my baby close to my chest with the other. It's amazing how holding on to a solid form can actually steady your nerves. Zachary remains fast asleep, even though I've jerked him in my arms considerably. My knees are crumbling beneath me, as I get a sense that something is terribly wrong. Suddenly I feel quite faint, as if in any moment I might just collapse. It's like my head is spinning. The officer's face is unsmiling. His expression is gravely sombre. "May I come in?" he asks me in his gravelly voice. "I need to talk to you, ma'am. It's rather important." I hesitantly open the door for him and lead him towards the living room, where he beckons for me to take a seat. "I think it's best you sit down, ma'am. Is there anyone else in the house with you who can give you support at this time?" "No, it's just me and my baby, but my husband will be here any moment now. He's gone to the Italian restaurant to pick up some pizza." The officer gives me a pitiful, tenebrific look. He slowly sits on the chair opposite me, where the remote control lies buried. My eyes are fixed on the control, anything to distract myself from what the officer is saying. I just hope he doesn't damage it, I think to myself, as his body weight is pressing down on the control, and those things can sometimes be rather fragile. "I'm afraid there's been a bad accident, ma'am," he says. I see his mouth move up and down, but his words leap away from me like a frog jumping over a lily leaf and leaping into the pond, until you can't see him at all. I wonder what the strange man is doing in my home, and what on earth he's talking about. He might as well be speaking a foreign language. He's trying to sell me something, some kind of security service perhaps. If so, I'm really not interested. We haven't had any issues with robberies on our street. How I wish he wouldn't drone on and on like this. I'm beginning to get rather bored. I cannot hear a word of what he's saying. "Ma'am," he repeats, "you have been hearing what I'm saying, have you not? There's been a dreadful accident." I stare at him abstractly, as if he's talking to someone else, even though I unheedingly hear his piercing words. My wistful mind is incapable of processing them. "Can you not wait for my husband to get back first?" I ask him. "I would prefer it if he was here with me. You can explain everything to him when he gets back. He knows more about security than I do. I must confess I doubt he'll be interested in the services you offer. We have seen your security car around our neighbourhood quite frequently. But I hasten to say me and my husband feel quite safe. There have been no burglaries in our area. Besides our dog here, Lassie, she's a great watchdog." "I don't think you're hearing me correctly, ma'am," says the officer, twiddling his cowboy hat in his hand. "Your husband is not coming back, I'm afraid.
I'm very sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but he's been involved in a dreadful accident. We believe your husband was driving at about 50 miles an hour, which is far too fast down that country road. When he reached a sharp hairpin turn, he was propelled off the road, airborne for a moment, and went flying into a large oak tree that borders a horse farm. The owners heard the loud, clanging crash, and so called for help. Your husband has been rushed to hospital, but it doesn't look good for him. He was unresponsive at the scene of the accident. The EMTs were working on him vigorously. I know this because I was there. I'm afraid they didn't get a heartbeat or a pulse. They thought he was dead at the scene, but obviously they needed this to be verified and affirmed at the hospital. I believe he's on life support now. He's registered as a donor for organ transplantation, so that's why he remains attached to a machine. But from what I'm hearing, beyond the machine, nothing else is keeping your husband alive.
The gravity of the officer's words don't really hit home to me. I just stare at him introspectively, with a bemused, vacuous look on my face. I begin to pensively tap my foot awkwardly on the wooden floor beneath my feet, while I rock my baby in my arms. For some miraculous reason, Zachary has not screamed or cried out, just when the distraction of his cries would have been a glad, welcome relief. The perfect excuse to block out the officer's cruel, thorny words that sting me viciously like a frenzied hive of hornets. My husband dead? The man is talking absolute nonsense. I only spoke to him a moment ago. I don't need to listen to this. If I refuse to believe what he's saying, then it can't be true. My husband is just running late, that's all. It's nothing to worry about, I reassure myself. I knew my husband would have taken the rural back roads, because it was a quintessential shortcut to the Italian restaurant, as Pearson likes to avoid the traffic of the highway, and the rural roads make a pleasanter, quicker journey. My husband can be impatient. He is inclined to speed, something I chastise him about all the time. There are a plethora of horse farms that fringe the sprawling junction, set in an extensive rural location, where long chains of large opulent houses with white wicker fences, along with lavish stable blocks, can be found. The affluent, well-heeled people living here have the best of both worlds, living in the heart of the countryside and not too far away from suburbia. They boast stunning properties of vast acreages, which showcase grandiose stables containing thoroughbreds and American quarter horses, and many of these lavish houses have extensive grazing meadows and rolling pastures. Better still, there are an abundance of horse riding trails and ubiquitous wood groves of trees in this very prepossessing area, where many gravitate to when choosing to escape the lights of the city and get close and personal with nature.
As I was saying, ma'am, your husband must have been speeding around that hairpin turn. That was his undoing, I'm afraid. He didn't stand a chance. The front of his truck is a write-off, and the back, it's not in good shape either.
My daughter, I cry out. What about my daughter Kendall? Where is she? She was in the truck with my husband. He picked her up from her friend Macy's. My voice rises up into an ear-piercing scream. Where is my daughter?
Calm down, ma'am. Your daughter's been taken to hospital. She's absolutely fine, it would seem, but she's being checked over as a matter of precaution by a doctor. When we arrived on the scene, she wasn't there. It was most peculiar.
What do you mean she wasn't there? I asked incredulously. Of course she was there. She was in the car with my husband. He picked her up from Macy's house. Are you not listening to a word I'm saying, officer? My husband and Kendall were on their way to get an Italian takeout. I heard her talking in the back of the car to him. She always sits in the back. She was definitely there.
No, your daughter wasn't in your husband's car when we arrived on the scene. I was there, so I know. We didn't even realize she was part of the accident until she came waltzing out of the woodgrove asking where her daddy was and whether he'd got better. She wanted to know if the angel that he'd been with had fixed him. We soon realized she'd been in the accident as well.
I stare at the officer nonplussed. You've got it wrong. My daughter was in the truck. I know she was in there. Why would my kid go to a woodgrove? What would she be doing in there? The idea is preposterous. You must have your wires crossed.
Your daughter told us she was in your husband's truck, which was airborne for a second, and went thundering into the oak tree. She was crying. She was very scared. She said her daddy wasn't talking to her, that the car became very quiet. She told me that the bear lady opened her door and took her for a walk in the woodgrove. She said the bear lady was very nice. I think she's in shock and is clearly hallucinating. It is what kids do when they try to cope with trauma. We think she climbed out of the car herself, waddling off into the woods on her own. She was probably confused, disorientated, rather muddled. Your little girl's clearly got quite the imagination on her. I'm of the opinion it's a coping mechanism. She must have had a terrible scare being flung forward in the car like that. They did say it was strange, though, that she managed to get out of the back door. Both of them were mangled, but one of them was wide open. From what I was told, it would have been physically impossible to open that door. But sometimes in accidents we see things we can't explain.
And my husband? Is he going to be all right? Where is he? I ask. The officer looks discomposed. He shuffles awkwardly in his seat, rubbing the area above his mouth with his hands.
As I keep telling you, ma'am, it's not looking good for your husband. I told you he was unresponsive at the scene, declared dead. Look, I will take you to the hospital now. I will watch over your baby for you, while you go and speak to the doctors and collect your daughter. You can see your husband and child for yourself.
My husband is not dead. You've got this all wrong. There's a very big mistake here. My heart was heavy as I walked across the white linoleum floors of the expansive hospital corridors, with the invasive, intrusive fluorescent lights causing my eyes to water. I could smell the antiseptic stench of bleach permeate the air, its sterile smell reminding me of exactly where I was. I saw men and women in blue scrubs rushing past me with gurneys, somebody shouting out, "Code Blue." I find a glass of cold water placed in my hand. Soon I'm standing at the end of a sterilized clinical hospital bed, where a man is lying with tubes over his mouth and nose. There was tape all over his body, blood congealed in his sandy brown hair. The face that I was looking at I did not recognize at all. It was swollen, badly lacerated, very bruised. I knew at once that this man was not my husband. There'd been a grievous mistake. My husband was ordering pizza from the Italian restaurant. He was running late, that's all. He'd soon be back home. What was I doing here at the hospital? A young, handsome-looking doctor came ambling towards me, wearing a white coat and a stethoscope around his neck. His disciplined brown eyes were framed by a pair of round, rather zooty glasses. He looked grim. His mouth was set in a stern, saturnine expression.
"You're Amanda Smithson, is that right?"
"That's right. What is this about, Doctor? I honestly don't know what this is about because I think there's a dreadful mistake."
"I'm Dr. Menendez. I'm very sorry to inform you, Mrs. Smithson, that your husband is now deceased. There are no electrical signals going on in his brain. He suffered from a traumatic brain injury, which has caused swelling and bleeding in the brain. He's had an intracranial brain hemorrhage, which means the blood is spread over the surface of the brain."
I looked at the doctor with a muddled expression, as his words were lost on me. So there was blood all over my husband's brain? What the hell's that supposed to mean? The doctor tries to simplify his language. He tries to make me understand what he's saying, but I remain vacantly detached and apathetic.
"Mrs. Smithson, forgive me. I will try to explain to you in layman's language what I'm talking about. Your husband suffered a fatal blow at the scene of the accident. Right now we're using a ventilator, which is used to breathe for him, because his brain can no longer instruct his lungs to breathe on their own. There is no dilation in his pupils, no natural reflexes, no brain activity. We have reviewed the CT scans again and again, and your husband is beyond hope. Once we switch the machines off, he will be as good as gone. I understand he registered as an organ donor a while ago, so we're going to need you to sign the relevant documentation on his behalf. I'm very sorry to be the bearer of such terrible tidings, but your husband is beyond help now. There is nothing we can do for him. I am so sorry for your loss."
"Dr. Menendez, that man lying in the hospital bed over there is definitely not my husband. There is some mistake. You've got this terribly wrong. That man is not him. I don't recognize him."
"Look, Mrs. Smithson, I know you're in shock. When people have been in accidents, their appearance can change dramatically due to the physical trauma the body is subjected to. But this is your husband, Mrs. Smithson. We found his identification in his pockets. Your father, who is downstairs, has made a formal identification for us. I'm sure you would like to see your daughter now, Mrs. Smithson," says the doctor, who speaks to me so kindly I want to bawl my eyes out. He calls out to one of the nurses, "Julia, would you take Mrs. Smithson to see her daughter Kendall in the special Piper ward?" The nurse nods. "Come this way, ma'am," she says, leading me down a long corridor, a flight of steps, and down another corridor until we get to a door. She guides me into a hospital room where my daughter is jabbering away as she's sitting on this table, her legs dangling over the edge. She has a lollipop in her mouth and happily talking to a convivial female nurse, telling her all about her tap dancing classes. "My teacher tells me that I'm really, really good," she boasts proudly. "I can also do ballet, you know, as well as tap. I like ballet. I do ballet every Tuesday. My teacher's called Mrs. Myrtle. She's really pretty." "That's wonderful," says the nurse, smiling at Kendall. "I'm quite sure you're a natural dancer." "I'm teaching my dolly to tap dance as well, but she's not as good as me." She pauses for a moment. "My dolly is in the woods. I left my dolly in the woods. She must be so scared." "Mummy," says Kendall, smiling happily when I enter the room. "Mummy!" She stops talking to the nurse and is thrilled to see me, running towards me enthusiastically, throwing her arms around me. She has a large red lollipop in her hands that has stained her tongue to a bright red colour, which she is sucking with a spirited zestfulness. The kindly nurse who was looking after my little daughter gives me a watery but sympathetic smile that does not conceal the anguish she feels towards me and my daughter. I imagine she's relieved that this hasn't happened to her. In truth, no one would want to be wearing my shoes, and I'm refusing to accept that the shoes I'm currently wearing actually belong to me, because they don't feel at all comfortable. I still cannot accept that the events unfolding before me are real. It's so much easier to be in denial. I already feel as if my whole life has been thrown into a meat pulverizer and has been minced up beyond recognition, into a repugnant smoothie that I refuse to drink. "Where is Daddy?" my daughter asks me. "Did the doctor or angel fix him to make him better? Is he coming home with us now?" I cannot respond to my daughter. What do I tell her? My lips clasp together tightly into a fixed lock, and no words come out of my mouth. My eyes begin to fill with tears that I'm fighting to hold back. I can feel my knees becoming unsteady, and for a moment I feel as if I'm going to faint and pass out. "Are you all right, Mrs. Smithson? You've gone as white as a sheet. Would you like me to get you a cup of sweet tea to calm you down? It might be a good idea if you sit down for a while," said the nurse. "I'm fine," I say, knowing I'm not being truthful. I'll never be fine again. "I'm glad to tell you, Mrs. Smithson, that Kendall here has not got any injuries in the accident. Thankfully, she was in the back seat of the car and she was wearing a safety belt. If she'd been in the front, I doubt she'd be here right now. One has to be grateful for small mercies. You have a delightful daughter, quite the charmer she is, and a moment ago she was telling me all about her tap dancing and ballet." My daughter interjects into the conversation. "Mummy, Daddy flew in our car like a bird. It crashed into a tree. It was really scary. Daddy wouldn't speak to me after he banged into the tree. I couldn't get out of the car, but the bear lady opened the door for me. She took me for a walk in the woods. She was so nice, Mummy. She told me everything was going to be all right, and Daddy was talking to an angel. So is Daddy coming home yet? Did the doctor fix him?" "We will go to speak to Daddy just now. He's in a hospital bed. You can talk to him. I'm sure he might be able to hear you." My thoughts were not focusing on my daughter's childlike words, as right now I wasn't keen to get involved in her illusory world. My daughter points up at the ceiling, and confusion dapples her face. "But Daddy can't be in a hospital bed. He's on the ceiling," she asks me. "Why is he on the ceiling?" "Why, Mummy? Why is Daddy on the ceiling? He's waving at me." "Daddy's not on the ceiling. He's in his hospital bed," I tell her. But she stamps her feet indignantly. "Daddy's on the ceiling. He's over there. He says he's sorry." "What's he sorry about, Mummy?" "He says to tell you he's sorry." The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "It's not the first time children see things that we can't explain," she tells me. It was a week after my husband's funeral, which was a larger affair than I would have personally liked, that slowly and surely the revelation that my husband was really and truly gone, and was never coming back any time soon, hit me as hard as a sledgehammer through the face. The news began to sink into me very slowly, like a creeping vine on a wall, that at first is barely visible, until its tentacles begin to spread out, and then you see it so clearly that you can no longer pretend it's not there. I will admit for a long time I was in denial, insisting that there had to be a dreadful mistake, after which I became incredibly angry. I found myself enraged with my husband. Why had he been driving so fast that day? Why was he so irresponsible? This was all his fault. When I tripped over his slippers beside his bed, his side of the bed, that is, I was furious with him for being so inconsiderate and not putting them away. I was mad that he had left me to raise our kids on our own, and that he had left me with the ubiquitous, overwhelming responsibilities of who was to pay for the dog walker, the newspaper deliveries, who would pick up Kendall from her tap dancing and ballet classes, who would fix the pipe when it burst, replace the light bulbs, or mow the lawn. I had not reached that place of acceptance, and I doubted it would ever come, as I had loved my husband more than life itself, and now that he was gone, I just felt completely lost. Both of my husband's parents had moved into the house with me to help me oversee my children, as managing a 5-year-old and a young baby, when your whole life has been flung out of the window with the bathwater, is not easy by any manner of means. I think Mrs. Smithson drew comfort from her 2 grandchildren, and kept saying that little Zachary was the splitting image of his father. I've never known how people can see an adult in a baby, especially one so young, but I agreed with her, for it seemed to bring her comfort, although personally I didn't see any likeness in my baby to his father at all. Maybe later on in life, but certainly not now. I knew better than to put a spanner in the works and destroy her illusions. Suffice to say, I was not handling my grief terribly well, but I just decided to make an effort to get through one day at a time, baby steps. If I didn't operate on this system, I knew I'd fall apart, and being a mother of 2 children, who are very impressionable, I needed to be on the best form possible. My babies needed me. I could not afford to wallow indulgently in my pain, for my lugubrious melancholia would have only served to distress my children. I was to learn that Edith Swanson had declared that my husband was the final green bottle to come crashing down the wall, which made the locals believe that the dark shadow over our neighbourhood had finally lifted. "Things happen in threes," she insisted. "Didn't I tell you?" I knew that much as I grieved for my husband Pearson, I had to hold it together. But trying to valiantly smile through my tears was never easy. One morning I heard my daughter Kendall sobbing, and my heart leapt. It was clear she was grieving the loss of her father. I ambled over to her room to comfort her, drawing her into my arms, clasping her into a very warm cuddle, while pushing the spiral blonde ringlets away from her heart-shaped face. "I know it's hard, sweetheart. It's very upsetting what happened to Daddy, but we'll get through this, I promise you. He's very happy in heaven where he is, and it gets easier with time, I'm told." "I'm not crying about Daddy," said my daughter. "Daddy says he's fine. I saw him the other day. He told me he's fine. I'm crying because of Charlotte. I'm worried about her. She must be so scared on her own. It's so cold in the woods." "Who's Charlotte, sweetheart?" "Charlotte is my baby doll. Don't you remember? The one with the golden hair and the blue eyes. And you can pull a ring at her back and she speaks. She can say, 'Hello, Mummy. I'm hungry. I want something to eat. Give me a hug.'"
Oh, yes, I remember, Charlotte. Where is your doll? My daughter whispered in a low voice.
I think she's alone in the woods. I hope the bear lady has found her, otherwise she's going to be so scared. Please can we go and find her, Mummy? I think she might be crying.
Can't I buy you another dolly? I say to my daughter.
I don't want another dolly. I want Charlotte,
says my daughter insistently, getting terribly upset at such a suggestion. So tell me, sweetheart, how did you say your doll ended up in the wood grove? My daughter looked very annoyed with me.
I told you. Why won't you listen? I told you lots and lots of times. Daddy flew into a tree trunk. I was scared. He wasn't talking, but the bear lady helped me get out of the car. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck, but the hare lady pulled it right open. She gave me some berries to eat. I think I left my dolly in the woods. I forgot it when the bear lady told me to go because she said that people had come to the car and the people would help me.
I was naturally not happy about going down those back roads to pass the place where my husband had met his fortuitous end, but I couldn't say no to my daughter's pleading voice. We'd all been through so much, and if Kendall wanted to look for her doll, who was I to stop her? I was only worried that it might not be in good condition after being left out in the elements. I climbed into the car with my daughter in the back, and we drove down these long dusty roads, where we passed a horse and rider who gave me a nod, and then my car slowed down as I saw a cross under an oak tree, along with a plethora of flowers and teddy bears. I thought I was going to be sick. I knew that was the spot where my husband so cruelly lost his life. It was his parents who had erected the white cross. I just couldn't go to that place. I was happy to have my attention diverted when my daughter pointed towards a horse-riding trail in the woodgrove.
It's over there, said my daughter. That's where my dolly is. Charlotte is in there.
If we can't find Charlotte, we'll get you a new one, I told my daughter. My daughter stamps her feet indignantly.
I told you I don't want a new dolly. I want Charlotte and only Charlotte.
The woodgrove with its open hiking trails was magnificently beautiful. The tall maples and oak trees confiscated the canopy, their boughs tangling into each other to make a big arch above our heads, while through the open boughs a pretty light twinkled onto the ground. The earthen trails were covered in a plethora of leaves, while there were ferns, shrubs and other forest vegetation, luxuriously furnishing the woodland floor with a natural opulence, while green moss carpeted some of the trees in resplendent layers. We could hear the trills of the birds. My daughter's face was confused.
I can't remember where I put her.
She began to cry.
I want Charlotte. I want Charlotte. I can't go without her. Where is she?
I thought my daughter was going to have a tantrum. Then I understood she'd lost her father, and there was nothing she could do about that. But as far as her doll was concerned, there was still a hope in recovering her. My daughter did not want two losses in her life, and finding Charlotte became all the more significantly important. I now understood why a new doll could never replace the old one, so I began to clandestinely pray hard that we would find Charlotte. I knew it meant the world to my daughter. All of a sudden a few acorns were flung at us, and my daughter cried out,
"It's the bear lady! It's the bear lady!"
That was when I saw a very tall human-like creature covered in long flowing dark hair, the colour of coal. I knew at once she was a Bigfoot, there was no doubt. I was astounded. I stood as still as a wax statue in Madame Tussauds. The creature was standing about 8 foot away from me. She was holding my daughter's doll in her hands, and my daughter ran up to her exuberantly and gave the Bigfoot a huge hug. I could see that to my little girl, this lofty, hairy lady was no different to any of us in her eyes. She was completely comfortable with the Bigfoot, as if the Bigfoot was her new best friend. The fact that she was 8 foot tall, covered in hair, and built like an army tank was irrelevant. The Bigfoot looked up at me and nodded. Her benevolent eyes were so incredibly kind, and there was a remarkable intelligence about her that seemed outer-worldly. It took my breath away. I got the profound sense that when she looked at me, she knew the story of my entire life. I could see compassion pooling in her eyes, and sensed she was commiserating with my loss. I felt an extraordinary peace rush over me, unlike anything I've ever experienced before in my life, as if I'd been personally touched by an angel. She nodded at me warmly, and I responded in kind. She handed my daughter her doll, lifted my daughter up affectionately in her arms, and bounced her a couple of times in the air. Then she ran her hands through my daughter's spirally curls and said something to my daughter. My daughter nodded at her. The Bigfoot then glided away, and when she moved, swinging her arms backwards and forwards, she looked like she was floating on air. I've never seen anything like that before. When my daughter finally got into the car with me, she said,
"That's the bear lady, Mummy. She helped me out of the car when the door was stuck. She told me Daddy is very happy where he is, and he's fine. She says you're also going to be fine."
My daughter proudly showed me her doll.
"Look, Mummy, the bear lady made my doll some new clothes over the old ones."
It was true. They had been made out of animal skin and were absolutely magnificent. I'd never seen anything like them before, so perfectly stitched with natural leather. Wow, they were incredible. My daughter was over the moon. To cut a long story short, I received a fortuitous visit from our neighbour Edith Swanson, whom expressed her extreme sadness at my husband's passing. I wish he hadn't died. He was one of the nicest people in our neighbourhood, who always had time for me. When she stood in my doorway with a potion in her hands that she claimed would relieve my grief, and I didn't doubt her claims for a moment, I took it very gratefully and continued to take it for 2 years after my husband's passing. It helped me cope with my daily life. I am not sure that I agree that things always happen in threes, but certainly it would seem in our neighbourhood it happened like that. I'm always grateful for the Bigfoot who helped my daughter out of my husband's car during that dreadful accident. So there are definitely angels among us. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.